Alright, I'm back here in Photoshop and now I'm going to do the texturing of the simple coffin item for cubic castles. So what I'm doing here is I've loaded in that UV map that I exported from Blender, and I downloaded a texture of some old wood from textures.com, which is a good texture site if you're working in 3D. And what I'm doing is I'm just painting in a color I grabbed from the textures.com texture, and using that as a base color for the coffin. And I just deleted the extra painting that I did using the UVs as a guide. Now what I'm doing here is I'm painting some colored dots onto the UV map and onto the texture, because what I want to do is load this texture into Photoshop and just see if the top strips are upside down or not. Because when you unwrap in Blender, it's not necessarily going to rotate them the way that you expect. I don't mind painting in upside down if I have to, so I won't rotate the UVs necessarily, but I just want to see which side is supposed to be up, which side is supposed to be down. Alright, so now I'm in Blender, and what I've done is I've gone into this material view. This is not there by default in Blender. This is a view that I created. You can easily alter the UI of Blender and create your own views and save them out, so I did that. And what I did was I made a 3-window view where the right side is a node editor, where I can adjust nodes to create materials for objects in 3D. And the top left window I use as a render preview, and the bottom left I just use for normal editing. The node view on the right side is pretty much the simplest that you can create. When you create a new material, you'll automatically get the middle shader, the BDSF shader. And what I did was I added a texture node that's an image, and I plug that in, and it will automatically use the UVs that we created earlier. So this will allow me to see the UV that I'm working on in the texture that I'm working on in Photoshop here in 3D. So I can come in here, I can preview it, I can see how it's looking. I also opened the side panel because when you select the texture node and you have the side panel open, it'll give you a little line there which has the 2 rounded arrows, and that allows you to load it. See, I loaded it, and now you can see the dots on the coffin. So I'm just taking a look and seeing which side is up, which side is down, and I discovered that they were right side up. You'll notice that it sort of jumps around, and so it's not like the other videos where you're seeing every little detail of what I'm doing, because this process of painting, even a simple item like this coffin, is quite long. So what I did was I just sort of clipped out the bits from my work session, and I'm going to explain the more important parts of what I did. So here what I did was I created a new image, and I used Photoshop's render clouds feature. And then what I did was I used the transform tool to stretch the clouds in one direction. And what this is doing is creating something that looks like a wood grain. And I'm going to use this new sort of stretched rendered clouds as a wood grain to texture the coffin. I'll also note that the texture that I exported from Blender was 1024 by 1024. I'm still working in that size, but the final texture that's used in the game will be much smaller. It'll be something like 128 by 128 or 64 by 64. How small it gets will depend on what still looks good. I will shrink it as much as I can while maintaining a certain level of quality. The smaller is better, because it means I can use less texture space, and it leaves room for new items in the future. And but what it means is, since I'm working large here, I don't have to pay too much attention to the little details on this large image, because a lot of that detail will be lost when I finally shrink it. Alright, so now what I've done is I've taken that wood grain that I created, I put it on a layer above the coffin lid, and I clipped it to the lid as an overlay layer. So that basically makes the lid look like it has a wood grain on it. Now what I'm doing is I'm creating yet another layer, and this one has just a gradient from light to dark. And I'm putting that on the sides of the coffin, which basically will make up the base of the coffin. So what I'm basically doing here is I'm going to mix those layers with the color underneath to make the coffin a little bit darker near the floor where it hits the ground. And basically what I'm doing is I'm faking some shadow effect. Since there's no real-time shadows in the Cubic engine, what I'll do is I'll sometimes try to fake some shadowing on the items as I paint them or texture them, so as to add, make them look a little bit nicer in the game. And I'm just sort of blending the opacity to a level that I think looks good. It's a subtle effect, but it helps it look nice when it's integrated into the game. The lines that you see on top are the UV guides that were exported from Blender, and when I save the texture out, I'm going to hide those. Now what I've done here is I've grabbed a strip of those top areas near the top, and I used the brightness command to darken it. And basically what I'm doing there again is I'm faking some shadow that's coming from the top of the lid, and I'm going to fake a light area where the light is hitting below that, which will be the edge of the base of the coffin, and I'm going to draw a dark line between them. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating something that looks like a lip between, or like a lip of the edge where the coffin lid meets the coffin base. So there's no actual real modeled lid versus base. It's all one piece. But by painting in something that looks like a hole or a shadow, you can get that effect of having a lid sitting on top of the base of the coffin. I'm holding down Shift here to paint in a straight line. Since it's large, so that the dark area won't be lost completely, I'm painting it 2 lines thick. Now I'm going to brighten the area underneath that, and this is the top part of the base of the coffin where the light would be catching the top lip, where it curves in. Most items have sort of a slight curve or a slight bevel on the edges, so you always see a bit of light catching those edges. So now you've got something that looks like the lid meeting the base, and then I made a copy of that and I brought it down and added it to the bottom strip. So now on the coffin lid itself, I've created another layer on top, and what I'm doing is I'm painting a vertical board. So imagine that the lid is made up of horizontal boards, and then there's a few vertical boards nailed to the horizontal boards, keeping them together. And what I do, I go into Google image search, I type in old coffin, and I look at some pictures of old coffins, and that's how I get these ideas of like where the boards might be and how they used to look. And then I'll take some blend of my artistic vision and real pictures and come up with a design. So these are the vertical bars the vertical boards that are holding the lid together. And then I grabbed one of the lighter wood colors where it's not weathered, and I'm just using that to paint in the edge of these boards. So in like a high polygon object, you might actually model those boards, but since we're keeping things to the minimum number of triangles, we're not modeling all the details, but you can paint in some of the details. And this is actually true as well of like high-end AAA games. When you see some of these like more modern textures that have all these little bumps and cracks and holes in them and the little belt buckles and all those details are not part of the model. The model is actually lower polygon, and then they use various maps. In this case, in Cubic's case, it's just a color map, but in other games, they use things like normal maps and bump maps and metallic maps to bring out that extra detail. Because even in a high-end modern engine, you still have a limit to the number of triangles that you can display. What I did there was I added a drop shadow effect on the layer just to give the vertical board a bit of a 3D feel. And I also added that same cloud texture that I stretched onto the vertical board, but I rotated it 90 degrees so it's following the line of the wood. And here what I'm doing is I'm painting in some bronze nails, and I just picked a color that looked kind of bronze, and then what I do is I go in using the original color into the color picker, and I pick a darker, more saturated color for the shadowed area, and a lighter, less saturated color for the highlight. When you're picking lighter colors, you want to go with less saturation, and when you're picking darker colors, you generally want to saturate. And the reason for that is that's how colors appear in the real world. So now what I did was I grabbed a copy of the lid hole that I made on the top, and I'm using it again, a slightly smaller version of it, to create the actual look of the boards on the coffin cover. And I'm just dragging and using the Alt button to copy the layer over and over again when I need a new line. Now obviously these lines are going over top of the vertical boards, which is wrong, but later on, once I'm happy with these slats, I'll go in and I'll erase the bit that I don't want. You can also mask it out. The advantage of masking would be that you could always paint it back in if you need it back later, but in my case I think I just erased because it was pretty clear. In this case, that's what I wanted. So I take all those layers that I created, I merge them together, and then I clip all of these horizontal cracks to the lid. Oh, actually, before I clip it, what I did was I came into, this is, I think, Liquify, and what I did was I just grabbed the brush to warp, and I added some slight bend to these cracks, and, you know, that's just to give it that old, rustic, weathered look so that it doesn't look like something brand new that just came out of a factory. The boards are kind of bent and crooked. Make it look a little more, I don't know if you call it realistic, but a little more of the style that I'm looking for. So now I'm coming in and I'm erasing those bits that would actually go underneath these vertical slats. And again, I'm not too concerned with the detail because I know that this texture, when it goes into the game, will be much smaller. So a lot of these little details will be lost. And this is actually kind of a slow way to work, but sometimes when you're painting and you're drawing, you sort of get into this mode where you're doing everything manually, and then you realize, oh, I can do it quicker. I could just grab the marquee tool. So I switched at some point. I also had to erase some bits that were below where the nails go. You might not even need to erase this bit here because, again, so much detail will be lost when it gets shrunk. You might not notice that. But you kind of do what looks right, even if you're working in the big image, because you don't know exactly what will be lost and what won't when you shrink it. And it's not entirely clear when you're working how much you're going to shrink it. Another note I'll make is that I don't know if what you're seeing here is what will actually be in the game, because I might take this after and put it in the game and realize, well, it doesn't look quite right, or it doesn't quite match the other objects, or I don't like it and I'm going to repaint it. So, you know, what you might see in the Halloween pack might end up actually being a little bit different, but, you know, it might be fine and it'll be exactly what you're seeing here. But that's part of the process. You know, I'm always painting, doing textures, bringing it into the game, and every now and then you have to redo them. That's just part of the job. Here what I've done is I've created another layer on top of the coffin, and I painted in with a sort of a grungy dirt brush that I have, and basically I'm just creating some weathering, some dirt, some aging effect on top of the coffin, and I found it looked a little bit too sharp, so I decided to blur it. And then what I do is I change the mode either to multiply or overlay, and then I find a opacity setting that seems like the right mixture so that the effect of the dirt will be subtle enough. So here I am back in Blender, so now I can go over to those circular arrows and I can reload the texture, and now you can see all of that detail that I was doing coming in here. I actually made a slight mistake when I did the UVs. I straightened part of the cover that I shouldn't have straightened because it was actually bent. And so I'm sort of noticing that the boards look a bit weird, how they're wrapped around. So I'm going to go in and add a break to the boards and make them 3 pieces each instead of just 1 piece going across the cover. I'm just taking a look at the sides and just trying to decide, what I like, what I don't like, and what I'm going to change when I go back to Photoshop. So now here I'm back in Photoshop, and I'm just using the UV as a guide. I'm finding where I want to break up that board so that those bends look a bit more natural. Now this is not too realistic, but it doesn't really matter because it's kind of a cartoon look, and again, you're not seeing all the detail, and it doesn't have to be realistic because it's for a game, and the game is kind of a cartoon-looking game, so you have a little artistic leeway. So basically, I'm breaking these vertical boards into 3 so that they sort of bend around the edges of this lid that I kind of bent to make it look a bit more cartoony. I'm grabbing the that little crack I made again, and I'm going to use that to define the boards on the base of the coffin. And I'm copying layers around again as I did for the lid. Here I am back in Blender, and I'm loading it again just to see how it looks, and I'm relatively happy with how that's looking. And I decided here that it needs more nails, and can't remember what else I thought of when I was looking at it. But I'm just taking a look. Sometimes I zoom out because when you actually see items in Cubic, they're kind of small. They're not really very close to you. So this would actually not be viewed so close up when it's in the game. It'd be viewed more like this. So I like to look at and see how it looks far away. So sometimes you want to make things unnaturally sized so that they look good when they're smaller. So the nail heads are unusually large compared to what a real nail would be, because otherwise you just wouldn't see them. So I'm grabbing a copy of the nail head and I'm going to paste it to add more detail to the lid of the coffin. And here I just added a little more light to the scene. Actually, it would be, the coffin will look more like this, a little bit better lit. Just added some lighting to the world using a checkbox in Blender. And so this is pretty much it. The object is now textured.